Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem. So, we wanted to present on the topic of OCD, and specifically in the area of Waswasa. Now, we're going to start, to introduce the topic, and we want to start talking about anxiety. Because I think sometimes when we talk about OCD and we talk about PTSD and other anxiety-related issues, and we talk about anxiety in general, when people talk about anxiety, we always, especially in the Western society, we talk about, people always say we want to live a life free of anxiety. We want to live a life where there's no anxiety whatsoever. But we have to understand that anxiety is kind of a normal part of our life. In our body, we have within our nervous system, which comprises of the central nervous system, and then that part of that is the other branch is the peripheral nervous system, and then we have the autonomic nervous system, different branches. One of the branch is what earlier Dr. Ibn Jalil was talking about, the flight or fight response. That's a normal response that our body experiences. If we didn't have that response, then we wouldn't be able to survive. So imagine like if you were walking down the street and someone just attacks you, or someone just jumps out of nowhere and starts to chase after you. If you didn't have that response, you would lose your life. So you have to have some anxiety to function. For us to sit here and present, we have to have some anxiety within our body. So there's a theory, or there's actually a law called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which talks about how, and the diagram if you see up top here, it talks about how there has to have some level of anxiety within your body in order for people to perform. So as that level of anxiety increases, the performance also goes up, and there's an optimal level of performance. But if that anxiety keeps increasing, then that performance level goes down and people go into the unhealthy area of anxiety. And within that, all of us have some level of OCD. So for instance, for those of us who are responsible adults, when we're leaving our house, all of us will check and recheck our door, just like once. Like if I'm the last person leaving my office, I'll make sure both of the doors are closed. I'll maybe check one more time. If you're, leaving your car, you'll lock it, and then sometimes we'll go by like a little bit farther away, we'll make sure we'll lock it again one more time. That's because we're responsible for our car. That's a little bit amount of like OCD thought that we have, like, okay, maybe I left my car unlocked. You want to make sure that you lock it. That's okay. But there is a difference between clinical versus non-clinical. We'll talk about that. And sometimes we use the compulsions to cope, and we'll talk about the differences are as well. But the problem is where it gets so out of control that it's unhealthy and it's getting in the way of our daily functioning. So just to kind of define some things here. Now, when we talk about
the slide too.
Say that again. Oh yes, that's fine.
So I'll just add something to what Dr. Fahad is saying there. This topic we're dealing with OCD, it fits under the anxiety disorders, is what he was describing. And under anxiety, when we think of anxiety, what emotion are we thinking of? Can anybody tell me? Dr. Samar did a whole module on emotions. What emotion are we talking about? Is it happiness? Fear, exactly. And the fear response, the fear creates the fight or flight response. And so what are we afraid of? In terms of OCD, it depends, right? We have all these doubts about all these different things. If you're afraid that you left the door unlocked, you're afraid that somebody might break in and loot the house or something of that sort. If you're obsessed with washing your hands, you're afraid that your hands are not clean. That would be what's normative OCD. That's kind of like the OCD category. But what we're going to talk about specifically today is very related, but a kind of specific kind of OCD. And that we would term in our Islamic tradition as waswasa. So it's not necessarily about checking the door or checking your locks or making sure that you wash your hands because you want them to be clean per se, but rather it's a waswasa regarding regarding religious issues. And just to take kind of a survey, how many of us, and he was talking about, we're all a little bit OCD, we all have a little bit of waswasa, right? And so how many of you have made wudu and wondered whether you made wudu properly or you washed every limb? How many of you have prayed salah and wondered whether you prayed 3 or 4 rak'ah? Right? We all have. How many of you have been, and this might be an embarrassing one, making salah and you're not sure if you release gas or not, and your wudu is broken and you're not sure? Maybe you don't want to raise your hand on that one, right? So he's a little bit more courageous. His level of anxiety is much lower, right? So we're talking about issues of waswasa. Now that's normal, right, for all of us to experience that, and there's a normal remedy and responses towards that. And we know, when we go and ask the imam or our mashayikh, and they have remedies and solutions. But what we're talking about is much more severe in waswasa. You make wudu, and you've made wudu the sunnah way, concentrating in everything, and then you make it again, and you still are not sure whether you have wudu or not. Or you are concentrating on salah, but you're obsessing about how many rak'ah you need to pray, and you need to make sure it's perfect. So these are the kinds of things we're talking about when we're talking about waswasa. And there's a term for this, a family, kind of a subset of the OCD disorders, and that's called OCD Scrupulosity. We're going to get a lot more into that. We're going to get into identification of it, and then and how it works, where it comes from. How is it that an individual at some of us were a little bit OCD, but then people at their extreme end have severe waswasa. How does that come about? We're going to discuss that. And we're also going to discuss some of the Islamic implications in terms of, Islamic law, fiqh issues around this, and some remedies as well, insha'Allah ta'ala. Those remedies will be useful for all of us who have a little bit of waswasa, and it will also be useful for those who have a lot of waswasa, though I caution it will be useful but not sufficient, right? Meaning that it's not enough that you just heard this and that you'll be, it'll go away, but rather there's more of an intensive process which we'll talk about. And it's a tall order, and we're going to try to do that in 35 minutes, insha'Allah.
Okay. So again, just to introduce the topic of OCD, for someone to be diagnosed with OCD, they have to have either the obsessions and the compulsions, or both, right? So you can either just have the obsessions, or you can have both obsessions and the compulsions. So obsessions are basically thoughts. They could be sensations, they could be feelings, or ideas, and they are basically repeated thoughts, repeated ideas, or they're also intrusive. So for example, the example that he gave of like someone who makes wudu, but he thinks that his wudu is not complete, so he makes it again, and he thinks again his wudu is not complete, and he makes it again, and this cycle keeps on repeating again and again and again. So repeated intrusive thoughts, that would be categorized as an obsession. Now, of course, in Islam, a remedy, kind of like a preventative thing is already there. Like the Sunnah of Rasulullah is to wash yourself 3 times. So if you wash yourself 3 times when you're making wudu, it already takes care of whether you've washed yourself in a certain area or not, and that should be sufficient for us, because fard is 1 time and 3 times is sunnah. So that should be sufficient for most of us. But for someone who is having obsessions, that wouldn't be sufficient. They would have to make wudu over and over again. Or for someone who think that their salah is not complete, they would have to repeat their salah over and over again. Now, compulsions, on the other hand, could be either mental, and we'll talk about mental rituals that people do, or in most cases, they're actions. So, for example, in this case, a person who doesn't think that their wudu is complete, so they're having anxiety over the fact that their wudu may not be complete. So in order to take care of that anxiety, in order to lower that anxiety, they do something, and that something is called a compulsion. So the act, whatever they do, in this case, repeat the wudu over and over again. So in another example, the person who thinks their door isn't locked, so they keep checking it. Or the person who thinks their hand is still dirty, they keep washing it. That act that they do to relieve the anxiety is called the compulsion. And sometimes some of that is also mental. So it could also be argued the waswasa form can also even be related to compulsion, although most of it is related to obsessions. Obviously, this is an area which there's not a lot of research that's been done in it. It's a lot, it's like a very new area. So we're still doing a lot of research in it. The obsessions and compulsions have to be time consuming. So they have to take, according to the DSM, more than 1 hour per day. And as it is with all disorders that people are diagnosed with, in order for it to be a disorder, it has to be clinically significant, cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So, if it's causing so much problem, like I had a family that I was working with, the wife came to talk about her husband, and one of the things that she said that the children were saying about the father was either daddy's in the bedroom or he's in the bathroom. Meaning the OCD was so severe that he was either spending time in the bedroom and he wasn't getting out, and when he was in the bathroom, he was spending hours and hours in the bathroom because of the OCD. So it was significantly affecting and impairing the person's functioning. So some of the common obsessions that we see, happening in clinical settings, and we see clients with, for example, exaggerated fears of contamination. So people won't touch other people or touch things because they're afraid that their hands might get dirty. Having doubts about leaving the stove on or leaving the doors unlocked. Urges to arrange items in a particular order. So making sure that things are facing in a certain direction or everything's in a certain order. Fears of accidentally or purposefully committing a sinful act, and we'll talk about that. That's specific to scrupulosity. And repeated thoughts of acting against your own belief. And also that's specific to scrupulosity as well. And some of the common compulsions, on the other hand, and like I said, compulsions are things that you do to relieve the anxiety that you feel because of obsessions. So if you feel like your hands are dirty and you don't want to deal with the anxiety of that, the person would be then repeatedly washing their hands over and over again. Avoiding contact with everyday objects because you don't want to touch them and get your hands dirty. Checking the doors again and again, checking the stove again and again because you think that you left it on or you left the door unlocked. And then with response to making sure everything is in order, you're unnecessarily arranging the contents of your desk, closet, cabinets, or bookshelves. Avoiding exposure to situations in which your fears or the onset of unwanted thoughts may come, or continually seeking assurance from others in response to repeated thoughts against your own beliefs. So, for example, if you feel like you've committed a sin or you've done something that may take you out of fold of Islam, you may keep calling like a scholar. I've done this. Is this a sin? Have I committed a sin? Am I kafir? You keep doing that over and over again. That is a common compulsion. So go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah. So scrupulosity is the term that we that's used as a subset of OCD in the literature for what we would term in the Islamic kind of context as waswasa. And OCD scrupulosity or waswasa is really around religious issues. Okay, and some of the Muslim manifestations of the scrupulosity include tahara, ibadah, right? So I had a client, for example, or currently still have, he's doing much better actually, who would make wudu and he would fear that he didn't make wudu properly. So he'd make wudu 5 times. Then he would go to pray salah, and he would fear that he broke his salah when he was praying, and that he would pray salah about 5 times. And then he would do ghusl, for example. When he's going to do ghusl, when he would shower in the morning, he would take over an hour to shower. When he would have to use the washroom, he have to hold his bladder because he's afraid he has to go to the washroom, so he has to wash himself. And he washes himself. He's afraid that he might have contact or have leaked into his undergarments, for example. So if you look at the course of the day of this individual, it's severely constricted, their schedule, what they're doing. And this is sort of the difference between, and Dr. Faz is going to talk about this, the clinical manifestation of a waswasa, and just you and I, for example, that wonder, did we do wudu properly, or did I break my salah? Should I make sajda sahu, or if not, should I have to repeat my salah? And something, of that sort. And then there's individuals. In fact, this individual that came in, he first initially came in for the issue of talaq, right? And if you think this is just exclusive to people that don't know what the rules are, it's not about not knowing what the fiqh is, because I had a friend of mine who was studying the sacred tradition, and he would and he himself had these fears himself, and he came to me asking, how do I remedy this? I know the hukum on these things, but I just can't seem to knock it off. So one of the biggest issues, one of the very common ones is, there's a baby over there that maybe needs some attention. Okay.
I think mom's there.
So the issue that he was dealing with was around talaq, because we know in the Islamic tradition, hopefully by saying this I don't give you waswasa, right? Suggesting or talking about something. So in the Islamic tradition, how a male would divorce his wife would be simply to say, issue a verbal pronouncement of divorce, right? And so that's very easy to do, right? And so people get afraid that maybe I got upset and I said something to my wife and I intended divorce by that. And so they're afraid that they've divorced their wife, for example. And so they come back with this fear. And so with this individual, I said, this is where it starts. He's like, just give me the answer, give me the answers. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Okay, I said, you want me to give you the answers? I'll give you the answers on one condition. When you come back next time, and you're going to come back with an issue of taharat or ibadah, then you're going to have to trust me to go a different direction with this. And he's like, okay, fine, just give me the answer. He's like, okay. So I said, no, there's no talaq that has occurred here. This is not talaq. So he goes, okay. So he leaves, he comes back. And lo and behold, he comes back and says, I have another question. I was making wudu, right? And I think I may have missed the part of it. So what did you do? I made wudu about 3 or 4 times. Okay, now you're making wudu excessively. Okay, just give me the answer, give me the answer. So I'll give you the answer. But when you come back with a kufr issue of blasphemy, then we're going to have a real conversation. He's like, okay, fine. Lo and behold, he comes back and he's like, oh my God, I thought a sinful thought. I don't know if I'm a Muslim anymore. He's like, okay, now we've covered all of the spheres of waswasa. Are you ready for an intervention? And he's like, okay, I just want to get rid of this. I just want to stop. Okay. Khair, now we're ready. Now he recognizes that this issue is beyond just the answer itself, and that there's something more deeper, or something more severe going on. And mind you, this stuff is really distressing to people who've experienced it, right? People who have OCD, it's very distressing. I had an individual who came from the other side of the country, moved to Chicago, stayed here for 6 months just to treat his issue of kufr, right? Because he kept thinking that he's not a Muslim as a result. And so it can be very severe. And then these are the compulsions. I kind of talked about it. There's the obsession, the fear that my wudu is not done, it didn't count. And what's the compulsion? The compulsion is a temporary relief. I'll wash myself and then I feel much better. But it's temporary. I feel better for that moment, but then it happens again the next time salah comes around, or the next time I have to make wudu. So you have this obsession, and then you have a compulsion to reduce the anxiety. The compulsion is your strategy to reduce it, but it's usually an unhealthy strategy, right? If you feel hungry, and you want, and what you do is every time you feel hungry, the hunger is uncomfortable, right? You feel the hunger pains. So what do? You eat, okay? And if you eat a lot, your body is accustomed to eating a lot. So if you eat half the dish, you're still going to feel hungry. That's discomfort. So what are you going to do? Well, many people will say, I don't want to feel uncomfortable, so they can't fight the inclination to not eat, so they'll eat the whole dish. That's temporary relief, but for long-term suffering. Because because if you keep eating that much, you're going to eat yourself into your grave, and ultimately achieve what you are afraid of, and that is self-harm. Yes.
So just to give more examples between healthy faith and scrupulosity, one example of non-responsiveness, and this is to spiritual intervention. So for example, for somebody who has healthy iman, if they went to a scholar and asked a question, and the scholar gave them the answer. So for example, like say if it was about the talaq, or if it was about the prayer, or like if somebody, did I break my wudu or didn't break my wudu, and the imam gave the answer, the mufti gave the answer, and they were satisfied, meaning they were responsive to the spiritual intervention, the healthy iman would be, that would be sufficient for them. But for somebody who has scrupulosity, it wouldn't be sufficient. They would keep going back again and again and again. So that's one way to define or differentiate. The second another way to define is what's called distress, meaning a person's praying to reduce the anxiety versus enjoying and wanting to pray. The prayer itself is not because you actually want to pray, it's more like because you want to reduce the anxiety. So if somebody, for example, has sinned, and our belief is that when you sin and you actually seek Allah's forgiveness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives you. Right, and we pray because we want to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you keep, if you're so stuck on that one sin that you committed, even though you've sought forgiveness, and you keep praying over and over and over again, because you keep having intrusive thoughts about that one sin that you committed, and you're not getting over that because of that intrusive thoughts or repeated thoughts, then that may be, that distress or anxiety. Versus you didn't want. It's not that you want to pray; you're enjoying praying. Versus that you're doing that to reduce your anxiety. Interference with normal prayer. For example, if you're in the shower for an hour or 2 hours and you miss Jummah, or if you keep making wudu, and I've seen this happen, at the local masjid, where somebody's making wudu again and again, and the jama'ah is going on, and they come out and they go back in the wudu room, and and they may end up missing congregation because of the wudu. So that's the difference between healthy iman versus scrupulosity. Narrowing in terms of focusing on getting it right versus losing the sight of deepening the relationship with Allah. And this also has to do with the last one, which is overlooking. Meaning, for example, when we make wudu, we have to understand the deep meaning of wudu. Like, why do we make wudu? Is it for the physical cleanliness, or is it for a deeper meaning that's within that? And when I had to deal with a client, I gave the example, and I asked him the question. I said, well, what's the alternative to wudu if you don't have water? It's tayammum, right? It's you literally take dust and you rub it on your body. So it doesn't make any sense if you really think about it. If it was about cleaning it, then why would the alternative be, making your body dirty, right? So the wudu itself doesn't actually have to do with the cleaning it, right? Even you might have taken a shower, and let's say you broke your wudu 5 minutes later, you still have to make wudu, right? So it's not really about cleaning your body, rather than the act of wudu, which has a deeper spiritual meaning. So sometimes you overlook the meaning of it, and you get caught up in the act itself. So this diagram kind of explains the cycle that Human was just earlier talking about, that a person has an obsessive thought. This is again repeated intrusive thought, that the thought itself causes the anxiety, and to relieve that anxiety, the person engages in the compulsive behavior, and that only gives a temporary relief. It's not permanent. And sometimes, immediately after that, there's another obsessive thought, or sometimes it depends again. Let's say another prayer comes later, and you might have the obsessive thought again. And you keep doing that again and again. One bullet point here that's important to remember is that family members, who are over-involved or criticized negatively, it does affect the treatment. So sometimes family members will be like, no, why are you doing this? You shouldn't do this, this is not how it is. That doesn't really help, being more empathic towards them, and realizing that the person's really suffering from it. It's actually a disorder. can really help the person. So I quickly wanted to go over some hidden compulsions, because when we talk about waswasa, we're talking about compulsions that are not really obvious. They're happening basically in the mind of the person a lot of times. The things that people are repeating, especially in their own minds, like related to, for example, even talaq issues. So hidden compulsions are mental rituals that are thoughts as contaminants of the mind, often unnoticed by others because you can't see what's going on. So the phrase is that some people wash their hands and others will wash their minds. So one of the examples is like mental review. So when a person is examining a past experience that happened and they're doing it repeatedly, for them they're thinking they're doing it for the purpose of letting it go, but because the person believes that reviewing the event will result in resolving it and subsequently reducing the uncomfortable thoughts, then it's a compulsion. So for example, let's say a person committed a sin by drinking alcohol, and they're just kind of going over it again and again because they kind of want to resolve it, because the anxiety of it's kind of like hurting them. Even though they could seek forgiveness, do istighfar and get over it, but they want to keep repeating the scenario over and over, the thought over and over. I drank alcohol, I committed a sin. And by repeating it, they feel like that's going to reduce the anxiety. That's why it's a compulsive behavior. Similarly, scenario bending is where like a person hypothesizes or theorizes like what would happen. So you replay a thought and then you add something like a hypothetical scenario. Like let's say, oh, if I didn't work for this company, then I wouldn't have hung out with these people and then I wouldn't have drank alcohol. Like a hypothetical situation. And you keep thinking of other hypothetical situations and keep repeating it, again, to reduce the anxiety of a sin that you committed, whereas, you could just, work towards forgiveness and seeking the istighfar. And that's why it's a compulsion. And reverse ruminating is thinking about the future, things that happen, what's the likelihood of something happening in the future. Thought neutralizing is when you actually you say things that's the opposite of what did happen. So you're ignoring what actually did happen. You're saying something that's the opposite. And I want to go into self-punishment, which is something actually related to it. So it's people who actually commit the sin and they don't want to talk. They actually talk about the sin because they feel so guilty about it that they don't want to move on from it. So they want to keep talking about it over and over again in order to feel the guilt and kind of punish themselves. And that behavior is compulsive, and that's why it's considered that. It is yours now.
So I'll just tell you a little bit about where this comes from, different theories as to where this comes from, and then I'll jump into some Islamic kind of considerations. Okay, so there's a number of different ideas. One is genetics. That some of us, why is it that some of us are more likely to get involved with this sort of waswasa issue versus other people are more comfortable, they don't have this issue? Well, one hypothesis is genetic predisposition. Another hypothesis is that it could be developmental, that a person comes from a restrictive environment where they've been a really strict environment at home, so they're afraid of making mistakes, so they're always detail-oriented. Another could be that they have their family do it, right? I mean, my client, for example, the mother would say, don't leave the house because you're a Muslim and people are going to see you as a Muslim and they're going to attack you, for example. Don't say, stay indoors, make sure you stay in the car, go to only Muslim areas. So some of it is social modeling. Others could be early trauma, what Dr. Jalil talked about. Because you were powerless and now you want to control your environment, so you create this artificial control where you try to control everything around you, from being neat and organized and imposing structure and order on everything, because once upon a time you didn't have order. And then one could be a personality type, and another could be that it could be a normal person that has basically gone off the deep end, for lack of a better word. They just keep indulging this waswasa. What if I don't have wudu? No, but let me just be sure and make sure. Let me try do it again. And it starts with a little, and it just builds and builds and builds. You go from making wudu 1 extra time to making it 15 extra times. And the other is what's our spiritual explanation for this from an Islamic perspective? Well, in the Quran it says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ. Right? That we have created the insan and we know what his own nafs whispers into him. right? وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, and we are closer to him than his jugular vein. So one of them is that we have our own nafs, right? That whispers into us these doubts, these self-doubts. And then another is shaitan, that Allah Ta'ala has put a shaitan and an angel with each person, with each individual, right? And that shaitan whispers into your doubts. And shaitan knows your weaknesses, your nafsi weaknesses. And so it will get you to, if you don't have any issue with cheesecake, you don't really like sweets, shaitan's not going to tell you to eat cheesecakes, right? It's going to tell you to do something else, because your nafs really, you don't even desire cheesecake for that matter, right? You don't even like it. So shaitan will utilize whatever nafsani inclinations that you have. He will whisper, and he's the greatest psychologist, right? To influence you to do these things. So what's the key? What's the approach? Well, the way to respond, the key intervention is exposure. That you have to be exposed to that discomfort. We talked about this vicious cycle, right? So what we have to do, for example, with my client, I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go make wudu together. And when we make wudu, all I want you to do, I want you to make wudu, and then you're going to start your salah. And all of a sudden he's anxious. He comes back for salah, right? So he's going to make the takbir, and he's like, I don't have wudu. And then he's saying, if I do, it's kufr, istihza'an. Because if you make, to pray without wudu is making a mockery of salah. And therefore, what if that's kufr? So now I have a bigger issue on my hands. I can't pray. No, I can't pray. Okay, fine. We're going to have to incrementally expose you to this. So these are kinds of ways, because we have in the Islamic tradition this concept of i'tidal, right? That ad-dinu bayna al-khawfi wal-raja, that religion is between fear and hope. And this individual is too much on the fear side, too much anxiety and not enough hope. And so what we have to do is bring them to the other side. So I'll ask you a question, for example. Some of the interventions we might do is to fix this cognitive distortion he has. And that is that if I don't wash 5 times, I'm not clean. But what's the definition of cleanliness? Right? So what would you say is the definition of cleanliness? Anybody have an idea? What's cleanliness? From an Islamic perspective, what's cleanliness? Huh? Half your faith. Well, yeah, it's half your faith, but how do we define it? So we have, in terms of cleanliness, we have haqiqi cleanliness, right, which is basic. It corresponds with our ideas of cleanliness, right? Like urine and stool and whatnot. That's not clean, correct? And then there's also, but cleanliness, taharat, from an Islamic perspective, overlaps with our conceptions of cleanliness, and some of it does not overlap. For example, is the water in the toilet, can you make wudu with that? No? Who says no? And Sheikh, correct me if I'm wrong, because we have somebody here, my teacher actually, Maulana Hamza. So hopefully I don't screw this up. So who says that that with the toilet water you cannot make wudu? Who says you can make wudu? Okay, you can make wudu, and I can see the people who've studied actually raising their hand. You can make wudu with it. In fact, if you don't have any running water, can you make tayammum? You can, right? But what about if you only have toilet water? That's the dilemma that we have, right? So you cannot make tayammum where there's water, tahir water. Water is tahir. So that's clean water. But how many of our nafses would accept that? How many? It'd be a very difficult time for any of us to make wudu with the toilet water, right? So we have to break this notion that cleanliness is what we impose from our minds onto what cleanliness is from a Sharia perspective. Right? So we break this idea down, And so we say that cleanliness is not what your nafs says. And this is, common. We might not have issues with this. But you can see how this becomes problematic. Because we see this as unclean. But what about an individual who sees tap water as unclean? Now we have a bigger dilemma on our hands, right? Because that person is going to have a difficult time making wudu even with tap water. Or if they think cleanliness is achieved only after intense scrubbing until your skin bleeds. So we have to fix this cognitive breakdown. So what we might do for the i'tidal is to take the individual and say, instead of making 3 washes, we'll get to a point where you do it once. That's fard. Your wudu is done. Oh, well that's going to be very difficult to achieve for the individual. But if you can get them comfortable on one, then they'll definitely be okay with the third. كُلُّ شَيْءٍ يَرْجِعُ إِلَى أَصْلِهِ. Right? Everything goes back to its origins. Yeah, so I talked about this. You can't control your thoughts, right? You can't control your obsessive thinking, but what you can control is your behavior. And that's what the goal is of this treatment, is that you might still have these pathological obsessive thoughts, but it's your behavior that we want to work on. So we're working incrementally on your behavior. Just give you some examples. An example of objective measures. That basically this we can extract from the Islamic tradition. Abu Hurairah relates from the Prophet ﷺ that if one of you finds a disturbance in his abdomen and is not certain if he released gas in salat, right, then they should either hear it or smell it, then they should leave the masjid. Then you assume that you broke your wudu. So it's an objective measure. You don't give your mind the ability to figure out what it is. It's objective. And so how we might achieve this objectiveness is by scheduling. So I did that with my client, right? I said, you're going to go make ghusl, but you only have you can only take 15 minutes in the shower. Or we start by 45. So he's at 1 hour, he says 45. So he says, oh man, I was at home, I achieved it. I came out at 46 minutes. At 45 minutes, I imagined that you're outside the door knocking. You're going, hey, come out. And I was actually speaking to you in my mind, saying, 2 more minutes, please. And he's like, no, I imagine you saying, no, out now, your time's up. So he's like, I quickly threw a little bit more water on myself and I ran out of the washroom. And then I started salah right away, so I don't start obsessing about the fact that I didn't actually have proper ghusl. So it's an objective measure. Breaking this cognitive framework, because the Sahaba came to the Prophet ﷺ and said that we have such things that occur in our minds that we would rather put burning coal in our tongues than to speak of them. So, and the Prophet ﷺ said, do you really have those thoughts? He said, yeah. So he said, this is a clear sign of faith. So breaking the idea that because if you're afraid you don't have wudu, does that mean you're a bad Muslim? No, it means that you're concerned about salah, right? It means you're concerned that your salah should be accepted. If you're afraid that you committed kufr, that means kufr is an ugly thing to you. You don't want to be a kafir. Therefore, that's an indication of iman. So this is called in psychology the positive opposite. 2 things that are opposite to one another cannot coexist in the mind of the individual. If every time you have a doubt, you think, yes, indication of iman. Shaitan does not attack an empty house, right? A robber doesn't attack an empty house. They attack a house that has goods in it. So that means it's an indication of iman. And the belief in your control over it will increase your control. So you can't say, oh man, it's got power over me. I have to exercise control over it. So an acceptance of that and a himmah or a resolve, azam, to resolve this issue. Then we have somebody who's very extreme. So this is an individual that's a little bit different than the treatment resilient kind, I would say. This is the individual, no matter what you do with this individual, they're not going to recover. It doesn't come up with as much wonderful techniques as you want, it's not going to work. So what's the issue with this individual then? From an Islamic perspective, look at the beauty of our tradition. The fuqaha have addressed this issue all the way from Dr. Rani has written a paper on Abu Zayd al-Balkhi's description of the diagnosis of OCD. Our fuqaha knew what they were talking about way before we even knew what OCD was. They say that if an individual has waswasatul qahri, that it's really severe, right? And it has ghalaba over them, meaning that it is so severe that their actions are not controlled by their own desires, right? They don't will to do this. They're driven to do this. They lack the capacity for controlling that. Those individuals, some of the fuqaha have described as, majnoon al-juz'i, junoon al-juz'i, meaning that they're partially insane or mentally ill, like beyond capacity of their ability to control themselves. So they don't have the ability to willfully intend, from psychological terminologies. Therefore, some of the ahkam are adjusted for these individuals because they're not mukhatab of the sharia anymore. They're not addressed by the sharia anymore. So they have certain exemptions. رُفِعَ الْقَلَمُ عَنِ الثَّلَاثِ, that three individuals are absolved from responsibility. Al-majnoon hatta yabra, right? The majnoon, the mad person, until they have recovered. So part of the therapy might be actually, hey, look man, even if you said talaq, according to at least two of the four madhahib, I know in the fiqh of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he says that it doesn't count. Even if you said it, it doesn't count. Unless you intend, like you had, full intention of doing so. But if you did it because of your anxiety, and you can't control yourself, and you just mumble things or words coming out of your mouth, that doesn't count, even if it's sarih. Right, so this is an example. Now, I'm not saying this as a fatwa, okay? So don't go home and tell your family members that, Sheikh Human said this and this and that. No, I'm not a sheikh. But the point that I'm trying to drive home is that there are, ahkam and rules and regulations built into our sharia that address these kinds of issues. And so that's why my suggestion is definitely for an individual, right? I'm not going to go into all these things, but that an individual should definitely come into a specialized place to be able to get some help, right? Maulana Bilal, Sheikh Bilal, who came in earlier, he does the religious consults, we do the mental health assessments, and we come up with a fatwa. We come up with a write-up for an individual regarding mental health considerations. So it's much more nuanced. Again, this is an overview. It's a general discussion of this thing. Just an example for all of us. Somebody came to the Prophet ﷺ. They said to Ibn Abbas, and he said, every time I pray, I get up to pray, I feel moistness in my clothes, in my garments, and so I'm not sure if I've broken my wudu. And so what does he say? He says, basically take some water and put it on your undergarments, sprinkle it on your undergarments and on your private area. So what does that do? It confuses you, this exposure therapy, because you're like, oh my God, is this urine or is this water? I don't know. That's the point. You're supposed to get confused by it so that you don't, and then you assume that it's probably just water, rather than thinking to yourself, oh my God, I wet myself and this is going to be horrible and I need to change my undergarments 50 times, right? So then somebody came to the Prophet ﷺ, to Ibn Abbas, and he said, I make wudu, and how much wudu is enough? He says 1 mud, which is about this big, right? Almost like a water bottle, about this much. And then he says, okay, how much for ghusl? 1 sa'a, which is a larger measure. And he says, well, that's not enough for me. Well, he says, well, it was enough for somebody much better than yourself, and that is the Prophet ﷺ. So then a person breaks this idea that, wait a minute, it's not my ideas of cleanliness that I superimpose on the Sharia, but rather the Prophet ﷺ is the example of how wudu is supposed to be done, and that's perfection in wudu. So then there's an interesting scenario I'll tell you about Ibn Aqil, Al-Hanbali. Somebody came to him. He has in his books of fatwa. Somebody comes and says to him that, Sheikh, I immerse myself in water completely, and then I think I don't have wudu. And then I immerse myself again, and I think I don't have wudu. And he says, okay, khalas, get out of here. You're not even mukallaf of wudu, basically, because this individual, anybody who immerses themselves completely and drowns himself in water on 2 occasions and still doesn't think that they have wudu, then there's a different set of rulings for that kind of person. That person is not psychologically well. Right? This is not an issue of a fatwa. It's not complex to say that this person's wudu is done. So the point being is that, this is complex, and we gave you sort of an overview of this. And if you want some more practical kind of suggestions, then we can have, you can meet with us later, or you can come in for a religious consult. I'll let Dr. Fahad say whatever closing remarks he wants to make, and we're going to pass it over to Dr. Rania soon.
I just wanted to end with, I know earlier we talked about how every one of us has like healthy OCD, but I just want to remind ourselves that, we never know like how, when and how it will go into the unhealthy OCD. So because shaitan can be very tricky, we have to be very mindful. So sometimes, like for example, we'll close the door, and like one time that you'll check the door if it's locked or unlocked. Or you'll make wudu, and like we're supposed to wash ourselves 3 times, right? It's a sunnah. And after that, if you have this doubt, like let me check the door again, and you just checked it, right? The second time you have that doubt, this is where the tawakkul comes in. So, may Allah protect us from this, vicious cycle and this, this very, evil disease and disorder. But the fact of the matter is that when that happens, this is where our tawakkul should come in, and we should tell ourselves, no, we have to let it go. It happens to me too, like sometimes at night when I'm walking up, from the first floor, I know I checked that sliding door that, to the back patio, and I'll always like, let me just go check it again. And I'm like, I just know I checked it like literally half an hour ago. There's no reason, and I'll just walk away. Because then, let's say assume it is open. What's the chance that somebody's actually going to walk in and cause any harm to me and family? Like the chance of that happening in Lombard is like, nothing. Even say it was in Chicago, this is where our tawakkul comes in, right? We have to kind of say, you know what? We believe that all good and bad comes from Allah, and if it's written for us to die tonight, then we're going to die tonight no matter what happens, right? So if you've already done it once, and the second time you're having this thought that let me do it again, pull yourself back. Because if you do it the second time, then the next time you do it, it'll be the 3rd time, the next time will be the 4th. And as Human said earlier, it'll go from one area to another. Before you know it, the entire day surrounds with these obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. So we ask Allah that we are protected from this, and our children and our family members.